There is a feature that almost every important building in America once had. Courthouses, train stations, city halls, universities, hospitals, asylums, even ordinary schools in small towns. Every single one of them was crowned with the same thing. A cupola, a raised structure at the very top of the roof with glass windows on all sides, letting light pour down into the building below. And then, sometime before 1950, almost all of them were removed, not destroyed by war, not lost to fire, not crumbled by earthquakes, removed, deliberately taken down. The roof lines were flattened, the glass was gone, and the buildings that remained looked fundamentally different from the structures that had been there before. Nobody talks about this. It does not appear in architectural history textbooks. There is no official record of a coordinated removal campaign, no government program, no national committee, no explanation at all. So why did it happen? And why did it happen everywhere, all at the same time? If you have ever looked at old photographs of American cities and felt like something was missing, you were not imagining it. Something was missing. And what was taken away may tell us more about the hidden history of this civilization than almost anything else we have lost. Subscribe if you want more videos like this. There are things in plain sight that nobody is pointing at. We are pointing at them. Now let us look at the buildings. Walk into any archive and pull up photographs of American cities from the 1800s and early 1900s. Look at the roof lines. What you will see over and over again on building after building is a cupola sitting at the very peak of the structure. Sometimes it is small, sometimes it is enormous. Sometimes it is simple wood and glass. Sometimes it is ornate cast iron with decorative moulding and lantern-style windows that catch the light from every direction. These were not decorative afterthoughts. They were not symbols of wealth placed on buildings to show off. They were engineered structures, built with precision, integrated into the design of the building from the foundation up. The cupolas had specific dimensions relative to the floors below. The windows were positioned at specific angles. The interior shafts that ran from the cupola down through the center of the building were not random. They followed a geometry that appears again and again across thousands of different buildings in hundreds of different cities. And almost all of them are gone. The Allegheny County Courthouse in Pittsburgh still has its tower. A handful of state capitals retained their domes. But the ordinary cupolas, the ones on the courthouses in small counties, on the schools, on the hospitals, on the train depots, on the municipal buildings that form the physical backbone of American civic life, those are the ones that were stripped away. And when you look at before and after photographs of the same buildings, the transformation is jarring. The buildings look lobotomized. Something essential was removed and the wound was patched over so smoothly that most people never noticed. The official explanation, when one is offered at all, is maintenance. Cupolas leaked, the glass deteriorated, the wood rotted. It was cheaper to remove them than to repair them. This explanation sounds reasonable until you start looking at the timeline. Cupolas were being removed across the country during the same decades, the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s. Cities that had no connection to each other, towns that shared no governing body, institutions under entirely different administrations, all made the same decision at roughly the same time. The leaking explanation would predict a scattered pattern of removals spread over generations, with some buildings losing their cupolas in 1890 and others retaining them into the 1970s. That is not what happened. What happened looks coordinated. There is something else the official explanation does not address: the interior design of these buildings. When you look at the floor plans of structures that originally had cupolas, you find something that most architectural historians gloss over. Many of these buildings were designed around a central atrium or shaft. The cupola sat at the top of this shaft, and the glass windows allowed natural light to fall from above all the way down through the building. Some researchers have called this a light well. Others have noted that the geometry of these shafts does not match simple passive lighting design. The shafts are too precisely proportioned. The angles of the windows are too specific. The relationship between the size of the cupola, the height of the building, and the dimensions of the central space below follows mathematical ratios that appear consistently across buildings that were supposedly designed independently by different architects in different decades. If these were just skylights, why did they need to be so precisely engineered? The Tartarian hypothesis offers a different answer. What if these buildings were not simply lit from above? What if the cupola and the central shaft were part of a system designed to do something else entirely? What if light was not the primary purpose? Before we go further, we need to understand what the Tartarian narrative actually claims, because it is more specific and more structural than most people realize. The mainstream historical account tells us that the 1800s were a period of rapid industrial development, when American cities were built largely from scratch by a growing population of settlers, immigrants, and entrepreneurs. The architecture of this period, the grand civic buildings, the ornate train stations, the elaborate courthouses, is explained as the product of Victorian ambition and European influence brought over by trained architects. But there is a problem with this story. The scale and quality of the construction does not match the available labour, materials, and technology of the era. A small county seat in rural Iowa should not have a courthouse that looks like it belongs in Paris. A mid-sized Midwestern city that did not exist in 1850 should not have train stations with vaulted ceilings, marble floors, and stonework that would require years of skilled labour to produce. The math does not work out. The timeline does not add up. The alternative history that has become known as the Tartarian narrative proposes that the grand architecture of the 1800s was not built from scratch. It was inherited. The builders of the American civic landscape did not construct these buildings. They occupied them, repurposed them, and then spent the following century quietly modifying them to remove or disable features that they either did not understand or did not want the general public to think about. The cupolas under this framework were not aesthetic features. They were functional components of a technology that the official civilization no longer used and no longer wanted anyone to investigate. What technology? This is where the research becomes genuinely strange. Nikola Tesla spent the final years of his productive life attempting to build a system for transmitting energy wirelessly through the Earth and through the atmosphere. His Wardenclyffe Tower project, funded initially by J.P. Morgan and then abandoned, was a large structure with a specific geometric design intended to interact with what Tesla called the natural resonant frequency of the Earth. The project was killed. The tower was demolished. Tesla died in poverty and obscurity, and his papers were seized by the Office of Alien Property upon his death. Tesla did not claim to have invented this concept. He claimed to have rediscovered it. He wrote, with varying degrees of explicitness depending on the audience, that the principles he was working with were ancient, that civilizations before the current one had understood and used these principles, that the Earth itself was a conductor that could be used to move energy from one point to another without wires, without fuel, without infrastructure, of the kind that the emerging electrical industry was selling. The emerging electrical industry had every financial incentive to make sure Tesla's rediscovery never became commercially viable. The financial interests of the early 20th century had invested enormous sums in wired electrical infrastructure, a system that allowed anyone to draw energy from the environment without paying for it would have been financially catastrophic for the people who controlled the energy supply. Now, look at the cupolas again. A glass-windowed structure at the top of a building positioned to maximize contact with the atmosphere. A central shaft running down through the building, connecting the cupola to the floors below. A geometric precision in the design that exceeds what simple lighting would require. Buildings of this type distributed across every city and town in the country, with remarkable consistency in their proportions. Some researchers, looking at this pattern, have proposed that the cupola was not simply a skylight, that the glass was not just for light, that the shaft running through the building was not just for ventilation, that these structures were receivers, terminals in a distributed network of atmospheric energy collection that powered the buildings from above rather than from wired infrastructure below. If that sounds implausible, consider what we know about the early history of electrical lighting in American cities. The official story is that electrical infrastructure was built city by city, block by block, in the decades following Edison's demonstration of the incandescent light bulb in 1879. But photographs from American cities in the 1870s and earlier show street lighting that does not fit this timeline cleanly. Gas lamps are well documented, but the sheer uniformity of civic illumination in early photographs of major American cities has led some researchers to ask questions about the infrastructure that would have been required to produce it. The broader pattern is consistent. Something about the energy infrastructure of 19th century civilization does not match the official account of gradual electrification through wired networks, and the cupolas, which were removed during the same decades that wired electrification was being extended to every building in the country, fit neatly into the gap. Once you wire a building, you no longer need a cupola, and once you wire an entire civilization, you might have very strong reasons for wanting to ensure that the alternative, the distributed, atmospheric, infrastructure-free approach to energy, is not just discontinued, but actively obscured. Removing the physical structures that embodied that alternative would be a logical step. Now consider the timing again. The 1920s through the 1940s. This is the period when rural electrification in America was completed. The Rural Electrification Act of 1936 brought wired power to areas that had not yet been connected to the grid. By 1950, virtually every building in America was connected to centralized electrical infrastructure, and by 1950, virtually every cupola was gone. The removal of the cupolas tracks the completion of wired electrification almost exactly. This could be coincidence. Buildings getting wired no longer needed passive lighting from above, making cupola maintenance seem even less worth the expense. That explanation is available, but it does not account for the precision of the original construction. It does not account for the mathematical consistency of the shaft dimensions, and it does not account for why the removal was so thorough, so universal, so complete that virtually no ordinary cupola survived into the modern era. If the cupolas were just old-fashioned skylights, some of them would still be there. Plenty of other old-fashioned features of 19th century buildings survived into the 21st century. Ornate cornices are still on buildings everywhere. Cast iron facades still exist. Decorative stonework that requires expensive maintenance has been preserved in thousands of structures across the country. But the cupolas, the specific feature that combined a glass enclosure with a central shaft and a precise geometric relationship to the building's interior, those are almost universally gone. Something specific was targeted. What we are left with, if we take this entire pattern seriously, is something that should be unsettling. The civilization that built the grand architecture of the 19th century may not have been the civilization that claimed credit for it. The buildings may have been inherited from a prior world that was more technologically sophisticated than the official history acknowledges. The cupolas may have been functional components of that technology, and the systematic removal of those cupolas across thousands of buildings in a compressed window of time, in coordination with the installation of a wired electrical infrastructure that served the financial interests of a small number of very powerful entities, may have been a deliberate act of erasure. Not the careless erasure of neglect, the deliberate erasure of suppression. We are not told about the cupolas. We are not told why they are gone. We are not told why the removal was so complete, so coordinated, so specifically targeted at this one feature, while other features of the same buildings survived. The silence around this question is itself a form of evidence. The things that are not discussed, the gaps in the official account that no one points to, those absences have shapes. And the shape of this particular absence looks like something that was removed on purpose, from the rooftops of the buildings and from the historical record simultaneously. The buildings are still there. Walk past your old county courthouse. Look at where the roofline flattens in a way that seems architecturally wrong, where the proportions of the structure seem to be reaching toward a peak that is no longer there. You are looking at the scar of a removal. You are looking at the place where something was taken. The question is not whether the cupolas existed. We have the photographs, hundreds of them, thousands if you spend enough time in the archives. The question is why they are gone, and why no one in any official account of architectural history has ever found that question worth asking. Why no preservation society launched a campaign around it? Why the silence on this specific feature is so complete? The answer to that silence may be the most important part of the story. Institutions do not ignore things randomly. They ignore things selectively. And what gets ignored most consistently is what would require the most uncomfortable revisions to the story they are telling. Because when you start asking about the cupolas, other questions follow quickly. Questions about where these buildings came from. Questions about who designed them and with what knowledge. Questions about why the energy history of the 19th century does not match what the official account would lead you to expect. Those questions lead somewhere the official history has spent a long time making sure you never go. The buildings are still there. The roof lines, remember, the geometry of the shafts that still hold the proportions of what used to sit above them, those measurements, remember. We just have to learn how to read them.